Cool. Thanks for coming, everyone. I'm Jon Palmer. I'm head of BI at GoCardless, and we've got Rachel Christian here with me, who's one of the star engineers on my team, and we're here to talk to you about customizing and extending Looker to catalyze growth. Got through the first mouthful. So I'm going to do a bit of scene setting. There's hopefully not too much information in this presentation, but there's quite a lot to kind of get through to explain the whole program of what we've done, all the problems we're trying to solve, and the technical implementation to fixing them. But hopefully we should have a bit of time for questions at the end. But I'll do some scene setting, a bit about GoCardless, a bit about how we use Looker, our use case, and then a bit of the landscape in terms of the problems we've been trying to solve. Using Looker and other data tooling at GoCardless, and then Rachel's going to talk to us about the actual clever, interesting technological solutions that we've used for solving some of this stuff. So first and foremost, GoCardless. So I'm assuming most people haven't heard of GoCardless, given we're in the US and we only launched in the US very recently. But fundamentally, we're a recurring payments platform. So recurring payments, by that we mean subscriptions and invoices, repeated payments of same or variable amounts. And the kind of GoCardless hypothesis is that the payments landscape has evolved very rapidly with the likes of Stripe and so on, but no one has really doubled down in the recurring payments element. So there's still a very broken system there where there's a heavy reliance on debit and credit cards, or even, I believe, there's still a heavy emphasis in the US on paper checks. Some insane volumes of payments are still done via paper check in the B2B market in the US. So what GoCardless does is it takes the card out of the equation, as the name suggests, and that has a number of benefits. But what do we use instead of card or check? Well, we use bank debit. And bank debit is fundamentally the mechanic of taking money out of a payer bank account into a merchant bank account with the payer's consent, of course, skipping the card altogether. And that has a bunch of benefits. So it's more reliable. You're less likely to lose a check or a card by removing that from the equation. And that has kind of knock-on benefits that our merchants really like. Main one being a big help in terms of involuntary churn. So simplistic example, you're happy watching Netflix, you pay for that using your debit card, you then lose your debit card or it expires, you don't get round to renewing it. Netflix have just lost a customer who was very happy with the product and would have otherwise carried on paying for it and using it. So we remove that from the equation, and as a result, our merchants see big wins from a churn perspective. And lastly, very relevant to this audience, is data. So we can expose much more insightful data around failure reasons and things like that than you would typically get through card payment. And also, we can use that data to build some very cool features in the product. So we can do things like smart payment retries. We can intelligently retry a payment that's failed based on the date when we think there's the highest probability it's going to be successful again, which is really cool. And we're an established business, but we're growing very rapidly. So we've got over 50,000 merchants now using the platform, and they range from SMB businesses, your local yoga studio, who you pay a few quid, a few dollars to every month, through to large enterprise merchants like DocuSign, TripAdvisor, Virgin, The Guardian, and so on. And as I say, we're going through a period of very rapid growth. So I think we've doubled in size since I joined the company 18 months ago. We've got 5 offices now from anywhere between Melbourne and, as of the last couple of months, here in San Francisco. And we're processing significant volumes yearly. And we've kind of, in addition to launching in the US and adding support for ACH bank debit, we've also, as coincidence have it, today as a business announced that we've now got proper international multi-currency seamless payments. So you can now be a US merchant and get paid by a merchant a customer in France without having to open a bank account in France, and do that, charge in the local currency and receive in your own currency, and that's all transparent and seamless and has all the other benefits of bank debit, which is super cool. It sounds like a bit of a sales pitch, maybe it is a little bit, but it's relevant to this presentation, this audience, because of a few things. First is hypergrowth. We're growing very rapidly in terms of headcount, in terms of the markets we operate in terms of the features in our product and the complexity of the business. So part of this presentation is talking about how you build data tooling to cope with that scenario. We're also committed to having a very data-driven approach to doing this. So, again, this presentation is kind of about how we put data at the very heart of this growth. Also, a key thing to emphasize, we're a financial services firm, so obviously heavily regulated in all the markets we operate in. So this is also about how we can build data tooling that keeps our regulators, our auditors happy. And we also have a responsibility to protect our merchant data, to do the right thing by them, but also to conform to GDPR regulation and so on. So all of those things will sort of bundle up into this presentation, and hopefully you guys will find it useful. So a bit more scene setting. Firstly, our kind of Looker use case. So we're 12 months into our Looker journey. We have a great adoption story at GoCardless. So almost everyone at GoCardless has a Looker account, and 3/4 of the business use Looker very heavily every single month, which is great. And if you catch me afterwards, happy to talk about how we've driven that adoption, but that's not what we're talking about today. And a quick overview of what Looker is sitting on top of. At GoCardless, so we have our Postgres transactional database up at the top here. That's what drives the GoCardless app. We have less formal data in Google Sheets, and then we have Salesforce and Zendesk and a bunch of other external systems which we ingest ultimately into BigQuery via tools like Stitch. And then from BigQuery, that's all exposed in Looker and explored, and everybody wins. But one of the key things to emphasize here is this bit in the middle. That's our personal data redaction service. That's a key component of both the GoCardless data ecosystem, but also this presentation. So that is a redaction service that is based on a whitelisting principle. Every governed data source that comes into BigQuery passes through this service before anything is materialized in BigQuery. And essentially, it's field-level redaction, field-level pseudonymization. So every field, it's on a whitelisting principle. Every field is assumed to be personal data unless categorized otherwise. And fundamentally, what that results in is parallel data sets in GCP, in BigQuery. The top one, the redacted form, and the bottom one, the raw form. They're identical in structure, but one is scrubbed and the other is not. So what is the problem? As I said, we're going through a period of hypergrowth. We have regulatory concerns. We have a desire to drive data in every corner of the business. And in order to do that, we needed to arrive at some very foundational principles for our data tooling. So we wanted, when we started on this journey, we wanted accuracy. What do we mean by that? So we wanted canonical governed KPI products. We wanted our core explores in Looker to express the core truths of the business, and they need to be tightly controlled both from a sort of permissions and data access point of view, but also very hard to arrive at the incorrect answer no matter how you interacted with those products. But we wanted to have our cake and eat it. We wanted flexibility with this as well. So we wanted to be able to take those KPIs, and we wanted to be able to add more lenses to them, more use cases, enrich that with additional data, but without compromising on that accuracy pillar. And then lastly, we wanted all of this to be secure and to meet our privacy obligations. So by that, I mean we wanted sort of scalable, transparent, auditable privacy controls. And crucially, we wanted this in public cloud environment. So we're at GoCardless, we are a self-hosting customer, but we still host on Google Cloud platforms. So fundamentally, our Looker instance is on the public internet, which throws up its own challenges from a risk management point of view. So we wanted all of that. What did we have? Answer, none of it. So broadly speaking, our data infrastructure was either monolithic or unstructured and ungoverned. And as a result, we had a lot of work to do. So what did those problems look like in practice? So first and foremost, we had multiple insight tools when we started down this road. So we had a mixture of Tableau and internal and externally developed SQL clients that were either querying our Postgres replica or querying BigQuery directly. That, of course, had a bunch of problems. So, there were minimal security controls around that, very few ways of determining who had access to what and enforcing any kind of control. And we had conflicting results everywhere. I'm sure we're not the only ones who've been through this journey. We had built some KPI products to try and address this, but they were quite monolithic. They were sort of very hard to decompose and iterate on. So they really met the criteria of accuracy. But as I say, during the period of growing complexity and more use cases and more lenses to be added to the business, we found it very hard to iterate on that and make sure the integrity of that was both maintained, but we could develop at speed. And we had flawed data privacy controls. So that redaction service was very cool, but what it did was land our pseudonymized and raw form data in data sets next to each other in the same GCP project. If you're familiar with Looker and the way that it uses service accounts, that's a big problem because we can only limit access at the project level in the way we had it architected. So we were relying on best behavior for people to not query the stuff that we didn't want them to query. And finally, we didn't have much in the way of data warehouse product standards. So it was really hard to tell the difference between a table that was an ETL artifact, it was just a stage in a transformation, versus the actual core dimensions as part of a core model that you really cared about. So we had to do something about it, and we had to change our approach. And one final thing to emphasize before we get into what we did. When we're talking about all of this, or this mindset, we're not just talking about what happens upstream of Looker and in Looker. We're also talking about what happens after the fact. So Looker has one of its many advantages is that you have it's very easy to push data to Slack channel conversations. It's very easy to push data to Google Sheets and to other integrations. But we needed to think about that in the same mindset. We needed to have the same controls. We needed to have the same level of rigor and understanding of what's happening and controlling access to it. So that informs our full end-to-end thinking. So over to Rachel to talk about a solution.
Cool. So now I get to talk a bit more about the fun stuff, or solution. So when we designed this, we wanted to build it on 3 main pillars. So the first was we wanted to do a data warehouse redesign. The second, we wanted to rethink how we did our Looker permissions and access control. And finally, we wanted to implement a hub-and-spoke architecture. So this is how our data warehouse looked before we did the redesign. Everything lived in a single project. We did data transformations in Airflow. We joined in reference data that lived in Google Sheets, and we put that transformed data back into the same project. Now, this approach had 2 major problems for us. The first was our redacted and unredacted data lived in the same project. So from a Looker perspective, it was really difficult to decide who should have access to what because it's the same service account. And secondly, our naming conventions weren't that great. So in this example, materialized views is actually the heart of all our reporting, but you can't tell that just by looking at it. And so users and even admins had trouble finding the data that we needed. So we wanted to do this design on 2 key principles. The first is personal data segregation, so structurally separating redacted and unredacted data. And then the second principle being separation of concerns. So we wanted to structurally separate different types of data, like raw data or transformed data. This diagram shows all the BigQuery projects that we have now and how they relate to one another. So if we think to our first principle, which is personal data segregation, that happens along the horizontal. So the green layer represents our redacted data, and the red is our unredacted. And as John mentioned before, the schema across these 2 is exactly the same. It's just that the values that you get when you query these projects will be different. Our second principle is separation of concerns. So this is the different types of data, right? So we have 4 different types. The first is our raw data, and that's pretty easy. It's just data as it is. The second is BI data, and that represents like our kitchen. And our kitchen serves 3 purposes. So we use it to stage data, and that's where we remove any problematic or erroneous data before we start to do any transformations or build analytical products. We also use it as a prep area, and this is where we store ETL artifacts, and this is where we start to do our transformations. And finally, we use it for reference data, and this is where we sort and sanitize our lookups. Then we have prod, and this is the materialization of all our transformations. So this is our core model that all users and Looker will access. However, they don't access prod directly. They'll access Data Hub. And Data Hub is our defensive layer. So it just contains views that are one-to-one with tables in prod. And we do this so that we can make changes upstream without worrying too much about breaking anything downstream. So now we have 2 separate projects for personal and non-personal. So that takes care of Looker because we have 2 service accounts. We can also kind of hide all our ETL assets or ingredients and only present like the finished meal or the core model in the restaurant. So this isn't like rocket science or super cool or innovative, but we thought that this architecture lended itself nicely to resolving the concerns that we had. So now, how do we consume Data Hub in Looker, right? And this, we move on to kind of our second pillar, which is rethinking our Looker permissions and access controls. So at the heart of this, we have our BigQuery project connection here. And the connection defines, as I said, which BigQuery project you're querying, and then you reference that connection in your model, as you can see there. So when you create a view, you only need to specify the dataset name and the table name, and that will inherit the project from the model. But we have a couple of different projects now, so we need to be able to do that dynamically. And for this, we use user attributes. So user attributes are exactly that. They're variables that apply to a user, and they're set by an admin. And in our case, we have a BigQuery project name attribute. And if we take a look into that, we'll see that that's set by default to our pseudo-anonymized project, which is our Data Hub. So users can't override this. As I said, it's only set by an admin, and they don't even know that it's happening. So if we look at how that's used in our view, we pass that in using liquid syntax. And so at runtime, this is dynamically set. And as a result of this, we can now make sure that by default, users are only querying pseudo-anonymized data. And we're also fulfilling the principle of least privilege. So only by exception will users have access to personal data. But as we all know, all personal data isn't equal. So we'll have we have different users, and those users will have different reasons to be accessing subsets of personal data, right? So if we think about a customer support user as an example, they may need to have access to merchant contact emails, but they may not need to access bank details. So what we've shown so far is an all or nothing approach. Either you have access to all of the data or none of it. So we needed to fine tune that a little bit and get some field level access controls. And for that, we use access grants. So access grants are essentially a LookML parameter that utilize the same thing we just saw, which is user attributes. And in this example, as we said, with the customer support user, we want them to have access to merchant contact emails. So we set that to true, and we set everything else to false. It's also important to note that we do this on a group level. So this user will inherit from the group merchant contacts because it's easier to maintain cohorts of users that have a reasonable need to access these things rather than at a user-by-user level. So if we look at that in practice here, we have the required access grant parameter, and we pass in that user attribute. It's also important to note that the liquid syntax at the top for the project name is still there. So if you don't have access to personal data at all, then the access grant is irrelevant because the data would have been redacted at source. So you will have access to the field, but you'll get X as the value. So now we've looked at how we structurally control access to personal data. We have a data warehouse with better practice implementation. The next thing we want to look at is our hub and spoke architecture, and I'll hand over to Jon again.
So as you see now, kind of controls both in terms of the quality of our KPI products, but also in terms of the privacy controls are a mixture of admin-side attributes and things that are expressed in LookML. And so we need to guard that LookML. We need to make sure people can't compromise those things, but we can't afford to then say that means only a select group of people at GoCardless can write any LookML, can develop anything in Looker. And to solve this problem, we use hub and spoke. So hub and spoke, in simple terms, is this notion of having these core models and being able to extend them and reference them in satellite models around which you add some additional richness and context. So in practical terms, we have a few use cases at GoCardless. So our core model contains our core KPI products. And then we have our ops team, our sales team, our product development team extending those. And we even extend them ourselves in BI, which is a bit meta. But essentially what we're doing there, we use that for experimentation and prototyping. So one important thing to emphasize here is what we're talking about with hub and spoke is not copying code. We don't lift the code from the core model and dump it into another project. Rather, we use the extends feature in Looker, and that requires a manifest file. And that manifest file is expressing a model, and it's literally a pointer. It's just saying, imagine that you can get the code from this core model and reference it here. So in practice, the pointer is actually accessing the hash for the master branch of your Git repo for the core model. So in kind of more practical terms, this is kind of simplified representation of this. So at the top here, we have a core model, and in this example, that core model contains two views. So the first is our merchant dimension, and the second is a merchant activity. Our merchant dimension, that contains the attribute of our merchants that pretty much the whole company cares about. So that's merchant name, the geo, the vertical, when they signed up, their current state, for example. And then on the merchant activity side, that's the things that we care about changing over time for a merchant, and again, that means something to the whole company. So how many payments we process for them on a given date, how many of those failed, and how much revenue that merchant generated by processing those payments. And then we reference that in these satellite models. So in the example here with the product development, they're referencing it, and they're joining in this merchants with new feature view. And this contains, let's imagine, a sort of row by row, it's merchants' IDs and how they adopt a new feature over time. So this is super cool. This means that we've expressed how you calculate some of our core KPIs in our core model. They get all the benefit of that here, but they can enrich it with something that means something to them. It doesn't necessarily mean something to our ops team. It's something just product development care about. So in this case, they can answer the question of, are merchants who are adopting a new feature driving revenue in a way that's different to the ones who didn't? Or conversely, are they driving churn? We need to act on that. Likewise, on the ops example, we're a financial services company, as I mentioned, so we're obliged to do due diligence on the merchants as we onboard them. And so that verification process, that due diligence process, is really, for a good merchant experience, we need to understand how that's working and how merchants are passing through that funnel. So in this case, they're joining in a merchant verification activity view, which explains, which merchants are at a given stage in the funnel at which point in time. So now they can interrogate that and can understand, okay, are merchants in a given geo or vertical, which is expressed in the core, getting stuck at certain stages in the verification cycle where merchants, say, in the UK, aren't. So that's got a whole bunch of advantages for us. Firstly, the integrity of our core KPI logic. That's in the core. That's not going to be compromised by any of this because fundamentally they're just referencing it and they're not changing it. Secondly, this is locked down from a developer permissions point of view. So not only can they not compromise the integrity of the answers they're going to get from it, but they can't compromise those lookML level controls that we have from a privacy point of view. So, but that said, we've fulfilled the accuracy, and we've also fulfilled that flexibility requirement we had at the beginning. So they're able to add more and more lenses, more and more angles onto these things around the edges, and my team, the core KPI team, can concentrate on controlling the bit that matters and let go where it doesn't. So BI, the gatekeeper, we make sure the integrity of everything is there. And crucially, it doesn't just mean that we're the only people who can contribute to this. Other people can open pull requests and submit features to the core model, but we in core BI act as the gatekeepers of the integrity of that. So if we imagine then that we've got this, we've re-architected our data warehouse, we've implemented these nice Looker controls, we've used hub and spoke to make sure we can still decentralize, we can still democratize access and have lots of people across the business developing in lookML without compromising all of that sort of stuff. Well, we need to then think about the fact that this business is growing very quickly, the use cases and the complexity are changing very quickly, so staying on top of the administration of that, who has access to what and why, is an additional challenge in itself. So Rachel's going to run us through how we manage that.
Cool, thanks. So in terms of permissions, out of the box, Looker does that very well. It's very simple, it's very easy to manage permissions on users. However, we're using quite a number of different combinations of roles and groups to manage our data access controls and also to properly monitor our hub and spoke implementation. So in the UI, it's not very easy to see how these roles and groups relate to each other. And also, we're growing really fast, so we have more and more users that we need to maintain these permissions for. And doing it via the UI just wasn't very scalable. So we are using a tool called the Looker Access tool. It's an open source tool that's built by Dylan Baker. Some of you may have seen his presentation earlier on spectacles. So it's really a very simple but effective addition to the Looker ecosystem. In practical terms, it's a Python application that allows you to use the Looker API and get your existing permissions as YAML files. You can then edit those YAML files in your code editor of choice. And then crucially, you can commit that to a source control repo, such as GitHub. And then you can either run the tool locally or via your CI or CD pipelines. So this is kind of an example of what that would look like. So this is one of our sample config files. You can either copy an existing permission, or you can create new ones, and then you run the tool. This is an example of it running locally, but as I mentioned before, you can run it using your CI pipeline. Now, this kind of very simple pattern has a lot of benefits. So the first is that it's version controlled. So we can see exactly who had access to what at any point in time. We can also see who is changing permissions and why. Secondly, configuration as code has a number of benefits. So we can re-implement our configuration if we had to migrate our instance or if we were using multiple environments. It also saves us money because our admins, or me, spends less time on manual tasks and more time on more complex things. So productivity gains gives us a bit more bang for our buck. And finally, it's more testable because, as I said before, if you implement it as part of your CI pipelines, you can have loads of unit tests. Thirdly, we can now be bulk changed. So in the event of like a company acquisition or a departmental reorg, we can now manage that from an admin perspective with minimal fuss. The one thing is that it does require a bit of technical knowledge, but in our case, the benefits we just spoke about more than offset that limitation. So we've kind of covered the majority of our topics. We've looked at how we kind of manage our access for hypergrowth. So I think the final point on our wish list is how we control access to data as it exits Looker. So Looker controls access to data as it leaves Looker via the same kind of semantically correct layer as you would via, like, if you build a dashboard. So you can push data to Slack, to Google Sheets, or to Excel, and you get the same data as you would when you query the UI. But out of the box, those features, they use public URLs, and public URLs are unauthed. So that's fine if you're on-prem and behind a firewall, but we are hosted on GCP on the cloud, and as unlikely as it is, if you were to guess that URL, you would have access to our data. So we built our own custom action hub, and that basically takes our data and pushes it to a private Google bucket, and then a script downstream takes that data and pushes it to a private Google Sheet. So in essence, it's the same thing as you would get out of the box, just in a more secure way. And just as a note here, like Zapier is often cited as like a tool to help us do that, but that didn't pass our security checks. So we kind of had to build it ourselves. But yeah, so I think that's it from me. I'm going to hand over to Jon to do kind of like a final wrap-up, and then if we have time for any questions.
Thanks. Yeah, so a few sort of points, a few lessons learned along the way. So that last slide we saw, where essentially some of the things that our security team, for example, risks that we were not comfortable with, you could look at that as a Looker limitation. But fundamentally, the great thing about the platform, from my perspective, is flexibility. We didn't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, hey, this tool isn't going to work for us. We were able to customize it to the extent that our security team is happy, we're happy from a development point of view, the users are happy because they're getting the products they want. They're able to get all the benefits of the full Looker ecosystem. So we've customized it beyond its limits, but now everybody is in a good place. Secondly, a big lesson here is our controls have to be end-to-end. As I said, our redacted data service, that wasn't really, we thought about how to scrub data. We hadn't thought about what was going to happen after it had been scrubbed. So now I'm super proud of the work the team has done, and to get to the point where this really works from Looker backwards in a really solid way. And that data warehouse restructure was obviously a big part of how we got to that. Thirdly, I think building for scale from day one. As I say, the company has doubled in size since I joined 18 months ago. The number of markets we're launching in is increasing rapidly, as I said, with the announcement today of sort of B2B borderless payments. The complexity is changing all the time, but I'm super happy that the work we've done is going to see us through many different iterations, many more spokes on the hub, and we're going to be able to manage those at scale and not have to scale our BI team linearly with that complexity. And as I say, that hub and spoke part of that is the key. That, for me, it really unlocks an awful lot of what's cool about Looker, and the sense I get is that it's quite an underused feature. I asked this in the last session, so if you were in the last session, you've already had a bit of repeated content, but can I get a show of hands of everybody who uses extends, who uses hub and spoke in Looker today? Yeah, not many people. But so I'd encourage everybody else to go and look at that feature and find out how it can suit your use cases. It's not just about privacy controls. It's really about any scenario where you need to control something, but then you want to delegate and have that iterated upon multiple times in a decentralized way. And finally, I'd encourage people to embrace the open source community. As Dylan's tool that we've adopted is just one of a number of things that is growing out there in the open source community, and we'll be adopting, and I'm sure we'll be adopting Spectacles in good time as well. So there's some great stuff there that can really help you solve some problems around the edges of the Looker ecosystem. It's now no longer the case that Looker have to develop every solution to every problem. So I think to wrap up, Looker flexibility is a massive win. It would be great if out of the box it could solve all of our problems, but we recognize that's not the core of Looker's value proposition. So if you're a company like GoCardless and you want sort of best-of-breed data privacy controls, and you want to do that in a public cloud environment, and you want to do that in a rapidly accelerating business, then the tooling is out there and the knowledge is out there to get you to where you want to be. Thanks very much.